Hello, everyone. My name is Sinéad Burke. I am the CEO and founder of Tilting the Lens, and I feel very lucky to be welcoming you here this morning, this afternoon, and this evening to our conversation with Finnegan Shannon. But before delving into the conversation, just up top to share some information around the accessibility for today's webinar. We are joined by two sign language interpreters. We have James on ASL and we have Alton on BSL. We also have Kim, our live captioner, who is providing captions and also providing a live transcript, which will be available to you within the chat box. This is a space of safety and access as a baseline. If at any point there are access considerations that you need that would support your participation in the webinar, I would really encourage you to, in the chat box, send a message to my Tilting the Lens colleagues. They are Connie, Emma, and Laia, and they will be able to support you with technical support or access functionality to ensure that you can enjoy today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. We're thrilled to have you here. If this is your first time at a Tilting the Lens webinar, you are most welcome. To give you a sense of who we are and what we do, Tilting the Lens is on a mission to design a more equitable and accessible world. But what does this mean practically and more specifically? We are committed to making a meaningful and measurable impact on the lives of disabled people. We do this by working with disabled people and by working with clients to create pathways for employment that don't just result in recruitment, but focus on retention, promotion, and positioning disabled people as leaders, creatives, and innovators. We invest in disabled people and contribute to the economic progress of the community through our research and collaborating with disabled people to scale our capacity and project output. We do this in the built environment, product and service design, digital accessibility, and company culture and HR. But we also try as much as possible to open source and share our network, our research, and our learning, which is why I'm so pleased about today's conversation. From my very first iterations on the internet, I have been an admirer of Finnegan Shannon's work. In the background today of my home office here in Ireland is a copy of Alt Text's poetry, which has been a text that has shaped my experience of access and my practice. I would love to introduce you, everybody, to Finnegan Shannon. Finn, you're very welcome here today.
Hi, everyone. This is Finn. I'm so happy to be here.
Finn, for access purposes, most particularly, shall we begin with a visual description of ourselves? And as one of the people who wrote Alt Text's poetry, I feel like there's certain expectations for a visual description that comes from you. So I'll let you go first.
I always, I always think about my self-description and I always struggle with it. But I'm on screen today from my studio in Manhattan in New York, and I'm a boyish white person in my mid-30s with bleach blonde hair. And today I'm wearing my NYC Trans Oral History Project t-shirt.
So, thank you. And to echo, I'm going to give a brief visual description. I'm a white cisgendered woman. I use the pronouns she and her. I identify as queer and physically disabled. I have dwarfism. And in preparation for today's conversation, Finn and I met earlier in this week, and we were talking about merchandise, and I was expressing my desire for an Alt Texas poetry cap or beanie, and shared with them that we have Tilting the Lens sweatshirts. So I'm wearing a pink Tilting the Lens sweatshirt. So, Finn, we've done visual descriptions of ourselves. I would love for you to tell me and us, how do you describe yourself? Who are you? What do you do for those who are new to you and your practice?
Um, I'm an artist, so that's kind of the primary realm that I'm working in. My background is in visual art, in drawing and printmaking, but now I really work in so many different ways. I've done projects like alt text as poetry with my collaborator Bojana Coklyat, that take the form of a book and workshop curriculum. I've done installations, I've made furniture pieces, but I think at the core of everything that I do, I'm really interested in what I think is ultimately a kind of unanswerable question, which is what is disability culture, or what are disability cultures? And yeah, I think that's always kind of like, yeah, what I'm thinking about.
Great. Thank you, Finn. I noticed that Patricia had her hand up there a moment ago in the chat, and I'm not sure, Patricia, if it was in relation to the use of the chat box and the use of screen reader in terms of accessibility. So if so, I'm just going to ask for those who are participating in the chat box, if we could move some of that conversation to the Q&A box as a piece of information for those who use screen readers and assistive technologies and engaging in a session like this. If their screen reader is audible, what often happens is every time a chat comes in, the screen reader reads out that chat and that piece of text, which means for people who are blind and low vision, it's often a distraction from the content. So Patricia, I'm not sure if that is the issue you were raising. Hit it by accident. I have surely misunderstood but thank you, Patricia. I'm glad you can join us. So maybe just as a reminder, we would love for a lot of that content and conversation to move into the Q&A box, just to ensure anybody who's using a screen reader can also participate in the dialogue, the conversation. Okay, so Finn, we have established your artistry and also your practice. You know, I have known of your work for a very long time. And I think what we have in common, if I could be so bold, is that we spend a lot of our practice challenging perceptions around disability and accessibility. What was the moment when you first realized that this was the work you wanted to do and wanted to build an artistic practice around it?
I think for me, it really came from the experiences I had with other disabled artists and writers' work, and just how transformative it was for me to um, see them articulate their experience on their own terms, and how supportive that was for me in terms of understanding myself. And yeah, I just felt like, wow, what a honor it would be to be like kind of part of that dialogue and conversation.
How has your practice evolved since, do you think, due to that influence and exposure?
Well, I think one of the things that feels really core to my work is cross-disability solidarity. And I think that is a practice that is always is always iterative, and it's always changing. I have some of my work really comes from my own needs and experiences. But I'm not interested in living in a world where only my needs are met. And um, yeah, and I really think of other disabled people as the primary audience for my work. And I want to, because so many art spaces are so inaccessible, um, like I kind of realized that I had to help shape the container that my work could be experienced within. Um, but it also for me is like a kind of constant learning process. There's truly, you know, infinite things to know about disability and access. And so I'm always like curious about yeah, kind of like the edges of what I know, and what I want to know more about. And um yeah, I definitely, for example, have seen my work get way more multisensory throughout my practice. Went to have like a studio art, visual art training, and there was never any discussion of working visually as a barrier. And through my collaboration with Bojana, and also the work of so many other amazing blind creatives, I feel like I've really been able to reorient to visual communication and be much more thoughtful about when and how I'm communicating visually. And also, um, when I do want to use visual access as one entry point, like thinking about how there can be really luxe and interesting alternate entry points for experiencing the work.
I love that idea because what it speaks to is access is something that is not just about creating an entry point for a compliance nature in a way, but actually is about how do you create an equal, if not better, visual experience for somebody who isn't engaging in the visual material. And how do you do that through narrative? How do you do that through storytelling? How do you do that about specific communication or commentary on identity and scenario? And I really do want to talk about alt text as poetry, but I'm mindful that we have people joining us who are very familiar with their work. We have people who are experts in digital accessibility, and we have people who have come to this conversation for the first time. So I'm mindful that even already I have used the phrase alt text as poetry more than once. But can you tell us what is alt text? And then in turn, what is alt text as poetry?
Yes, I will try. I feel like I've been working on this project with Bojana for over 7 years now, but I feel like it can be a tricky thing to explain. But basically, alt text is a system of descriptions of images or GIFs that are built into digital interfaces and the internet. And alt text is used actually in a few different ways. For example, it's also really important for people who have slow internet connections because the alt text will display before an image loads. And it's also really important to people who are using screen readers to access digital content. And a screen reader is a piece of software, so it can be on any device. It can be on a computer, it can be on a phone, a tablet. And a screen reader user on a website, for example, is able to, the screen reader can either output to text to speech, so things can be read aloud, or to a digital braille display. And on a website, for example, a screen reader user might go to the menu bar, might go to the title of the page, a paragraph of text, the next paragraph of text. But when the screen reader gets to an image, it can't read the image. So it knows to look for this piece of information that's associated with the image in the code, and that is called alt text. And for sighted people or non-screen reader users, like that is not visually apparent on a website usually, which can sometimes cause confusion. But yeah, if you know, basically the purpose of the alt text is to give some context for what that image is, why it's there, what kind of information it's conveying. And yeah, and I think as you've alluded to, like many access things, alt text has often been treated in a very compliance-oriented way. This really kind of the idea that if there is alt text, then it is accessible. And I think as artists coming to this, Bojana and I both were like, wait, what? Like, what do you mean? You know, like, how is the image being described and what's being described? And yeah, and like, you know, there's often this feeling that can come through an access of this very like dry, perfunctory, minimum effort type feeling. And instead, yeah, I think that feels really different than the type of access that I experience around other disabled people in disability art spaces. I was experiencing a lot of really exciting and creative approaches to description in dance work and performance. And yeah, and so we really like created the project in order to have time and space to talk with other people about the questions that come up when translating visual information into text. And the idea of alt text as poetry really came from this idea of like, maybe we can shake people out of this compliance-oriented mindset if we frame this as a creative writing practice. And also that there's already a lot of thinking that's been done in the world of poetry that might be interesting to reference. So just things like attention to language, really thinking about what words we're using, what's the tone. Um, of course, there's lots in poetry that's like shows us that you can write something very short and concise that's also very expressive. Um, and then, yeah, just this idea of like an experimental approach, like it felt like um, a lot of the alt text that we were reading was really like one note and kind of being like, what happens if we try some different approaches and like maybe some of those won't be right, but like yeah, let's see what's possible and kind of like build more of a collective toolkit around how we could approach this.
I think this is so important that we have this conversation now, being mindful of what is happening in the world globally around disability and particularly around access, whether that is the removal of legislation or whether that is what is happening in Europe, which is the introduction of the European Accessibility Act. So on June 28th, 2025, the EAA will come into force. So businesses that are selling products and services into the EU will have to be accessible. And alt text is one of those pillars or formats of accessibility. And when you talk to that notion of it being compliance based, I think depending on where or who you engage in advice around alt text, often the instruction is it should be no more than 2 lines and it should be succinct and it should be brief. And what I have learned in my practice around accessibility is that there is more than one way to create access. And what is accessible for one person, even one person who is blind or is a screen reader user, is not necessarily what another person wants. So as we think about alt text as poetry, that can be beautiful escapism for some, or beautiful visual language for another, and a complete nuisance for someone else, in the way that people have just different interests in life also. And trying to create greater visual lexicon within alt text is important. And maybe just the other thing for people to know is that if you are newer to this conversation around alt text, what Finn was talking about there in terms of either websites or your own practice on Instagram or social media, for example, alt text is most often and not built in by design. So more often than not, what we are seeing is those spaces for alt text are left blank. So there is no visual communication for those who are screen reader users. Now, with the prevalence of AI, and we'll talk about this later, we are seeing AI fill some of the gaps, but again, it's not creating the visual language that we are talking about. And in that notion of visual language, I want to ask you about alt text selfies, because if I think about the evolution from alt text as poetry to whether that is in museums or art spaces or just broadly on the internet, and really moving that dial from function to creative practice, tell me a little bit about alt text selfies.
So, alt text selfies is a newish project that was kind of an offshoot of alt text as poetry. It's also a collaboration with Bojana Coklyat and a third collaborator, Olivia Dreisinger. And actually, as I was briefly looking through the attendee list, I think there also Thomas Reed we published an essay that Thomas Reed wrote for it. Tai Lu has a selfie in it, but it's basically, alt text as poetry is a curriculum. It's really about creating a kind of space for practice. And I think alt text selfies is really just like a celebration of a kind of genre of writing. Which is like how people share images of themselves online and how they describe those images. So we did an open call where we collected over 100 self-descriptions. And there's a huge variety. I think going back to this idea of, um, the ways that like disability culture holds so much difference and nuance. And so, um, so we now have a website that houses those. We also published a chat book that has a selection of 30 of them. But it's truly like, for me, it's just, I learned so much from the way that other people describe themselves. both in terms of like strategies for self-description, but then also just I think it can be a really generous like social interaction. You know, you get to understand more about how someone um, like perceives themselves, and especially thinking about social media or something like that, and the idea of a selfie generally, this kind of like sharing of a certain type of like witnessing or allowing yourself to be witnessed, I think is really beautiful. So yeah, I just am so grateful to everyone who shared a selfie for the project. We're also like collecting those on an ongoing basis. So if anyone here wants to add to the project, the idea is that it will kind of like continue growing.
Yeah. And we will absolutely share both the link to the Alt Text Selfie project and also Alt Text as Poetry too, in terms of where people can purchase the toolkit and the book also. But I want to just talk for a minute around the practicalities of alt text. So whether it's a selfie or whether it's an image, how do you start? What does that artistic practice look like? Do you start with background, foreground, person, identity? Is there one way to do it? What does better or best practice look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is always the question. It's like there's really no, I mean, there's lots of different strategies and ideas of best practices and things like that. And I feel like, yeah, in my role as an artist, I'm really thinking, yeah, mostly about the kind of questions that come up. But I can also just talk about like my own experience writing alt text. I think like a lot of visual artists, I don't think of myself as necessarily a strong writer or sometimes feel intimidated by writing. Um, and so it's been a really fun journey for me where, you know, and I really have felt like anything, it's a practice. You know, the more that I've done it, the more I feel some ease around kind of thinking about it. But yeah, for me, I usually start by thinking about context and audience, like where is this image being shared? Who is it being shared with? Like, why am I sharing this image? Um, and then, especially if I'm sharing it on social media, I'm thinking about like, yeah, like someone who's on my social media page is there for my perspective. So I'm really like rooted in, yeah, how do I see or understand this image? Um, and sometimes I'll think about kind of like what I notice first, what feels most prominent. Um, but yeah, I think there's lots of different like I've heard lots of different ideas about kind of how to structure alt text, like yeah, starting big picture and then going more granular. Um, for me, I find like mood and feeling are really important. I think especially thinking about artworks. And so uh yeah, I think when I'm thinking about the words that I'm choosing, just like really tuning into like, okay, what's the vibe of this image? Like, is it a goofy image? Is it serious? Is it sad? Like, you know, how do I make sure that the mood of the image is coming through in the writing?
It, I have a kind of different process in the sense of, and maybe I could give two examples of projects that we at Tilting the Lens have worked on around alt text. So one, we have worked with Gucci for quite some time and support them in implementing the work around creating greater opportunities for disabled people at Gucci. And for a considerable period, we supported them in designing and developing alt text for all of their visual assets across social media. And inspired by alt text as poetry, we really tried to think about that imagery as a visual experience. So much of fashion's vocabulary is rooted in that visualization. It is never just a pair of pants, almost to quote The Devil Wears Prada. It is a specific color, it is a specific fabric, it is a specific mood, to your point, for a reason. There is a reason why all of those things are picked, but also there is a reason why people need or may want to know that information. Even thinking about the fabrication of something, and particularly if you're neurodivergent and or autistic, you may want to know if you have sensitivities to that. Whereas most imagery doesn't communicate that information, whether or not you use assistive technology. And that being a visual way into something, and particularly a world that often feels so inaccessible to most people. And the second piece was around when we as a team consulted on British Vogue's reframing fashion issue in May 2023. And one of the toolkits that we tried to put in place in advance of the images even being published or edited was trying to create or gather information from people. So speaking again about this opportunity for alt text to also communicate identity, one of the things that we were really specific on was, where are people from? How do they choose to identify? What are their pronouns? And I think questions can be asked about whether or not that is relevant in alt text. But the reality is, after the image is taken, if you don't gather that information in the moment, you may lose it. So your alt text can't be as accurate, or you then have incorrect or an unequal amount of information of everybody who is in the shot or is in the image. So even just thinking about how do we gather that information and the insight so that the alt text can be correct. And then in thinking about other opportunities, purely from an algorithmic perspective, from an SEO and a search engine perspective, whatever industry you work in, or even if it's about creating your own content, the availability of alt text to be more informative and more visual and more creative gives a greater likelihood that it will end up within the algorithm if that's something that you want. So again, just thinking about those multiple focuses. I want to ask you around thinking of, this idea of people feeling that alt text as poetry is a distraction from its essential function. Would you have a response to that? And, I'm conscious we've talked already about how disabled people disagree, much like anybody disagrees. But I guess how do we manage that friction in our own community, but also for allies and advocates who are trying to make the world more accessible, but knowing that there isn't just one definition of accessibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, um, yeah, I mean, poetry has an association with being maybe hard to understand or very flowery language or things like that. But for me, that's not really an essential part of poetry. And I think there's a lot to learn also from plain language movements about ways that very clear and direct communication can be incredibly beautiful and poetic. And I'll also say, we try to be very clear in our workshops and in the book that for us, access is always at the core, and that like yeah, we're only interested in experimentation towards access, not just kind of like yeah, experimentation for the sake of experimentation. Though for people who want to do that, I think there's a whole genre of writing that is in that arena that's beautiful and has its time and place. Um, So yeah, I mean, but I think it always, access is always about relationships and it's always about, the specific people who are involved. And so I think like, um, yeah, it's always the process of like, thinking through feedback, trying something, seeing how it lands, seeing who it works for, seeing who it doesn't work for. Um, but yeah, I think for me, well, and also just like the poetry that I'm drawn to tends to be very kind of like grounded. That's a type of language that I really, really love. Um, but I mean, maybe there's a bigger question about like what is the role of creativity in access? And I think for me, in conversations that I've had with non-disabled people about access, in the compliance-oriented framework, like it feels like this huge chore. And there are parts of access that are like, that do just kind of involve a certain amount of like routine work. But I think one of the things that I've found through thinking about access creatively or in the arts is that like yeah, sometimes people don't know that access can be fun or access can be interesting or access can be like pleasurable or enjoyable. And I think, yeah, that's something that can like draw people into this world and make them feel excited about yeah, doing more, being involved or things like that. Um and so for me, that's kind of like part of why I often go back to this idea of like, yeah, thinking about access in ways that are still really like clear and critical about things that are not working, but also, yeah, make space for like disabled joy and play and fun and yeah.
And access is iterative, right? To your point about it being creative, the reality is access will always be evolving, accessibility will always be evolving in order to ensure that we leave nobody behind. And it has to be about that constant and continuous progress and evolution and ensuring that we are designing access with disabled people, particularly those who are underrepresented, multiply marginalized, to ensure that as we design those systems of access, everybody's included. And I think about what you said around kind of should access be creative? And I wonder if there's other terms that we can also be using. So should access be creative? Should access be aesthetic? Should access be beautiful? And when I think about whether it is in the built environment or digital accessibility, for such a long time, access has been designed for disabled people, reaching a standard that was also designed without disabled people. And even if we think about the principles of universal design, of which there are 7, and I really like the notion of universal design. I think the idea of designing for one and extending to everyone is really challenging. But of those 7 principles, there isn't a single one that is about aesthetic, which is why when you enter into a public accessible bathroom, very few of them have any aesthetic considerations. And I think that lack of focus on creativity, design, aesthetic, beauty further undermines the dignity that disabled people feel, because access is not something that we get to enjoy, but have to be in receipt of in order to exist. And I think there's a real opportunity to reframe that within our community ourselves. Again, never distracting from the functionality and necessity of access, but really underlying that we deserve creativity, we deserve innovation, we deserve beauty and aesthetics and dignity, and we can be the authors and the artists of that, which I think is so fundamental to all of your practice. Finn, when we met earlier this week, I think one of the first things that I embarrassingly said to you, besides fawning all over you, was, where can I buy a bench? And immediately you knew what I meant. And you told me that you had a gallerist, and I went, okay, I'll save for a bit and see what I can do. But I think about your work, and maybe to give a visual example of my memory of it, you've created lots of furniture pieces that have a blue and yellow kind of theme to them in terms of colorway, where potentially the bench or the seat is blue and the text is yellow, or vice versa. And they
White.
often
Text
white.
is white.
Thank you, white. And they exist in museum and gallery spaces, and they often say things like, this exhibition has asked me to stand for too long. Sit down if you agree. It is a very physical reminder of just how many spaces are not designed for rest. They're not designed for disabled people to be there for any long time. And I would just love to learn a little bit more about those pieces, how they came about, and I guess how you want people to engage with that work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that work really comes from my own access needs. I think I'm an artist. I like to go to museums when I can. I Museums are infamously hostile and tiring spaces. And I was noticing just yeah, I mean, I need to sit down a lot. I'm always kind of tuned into like where there are places to rest and where there aren't. And I was noticing that museums had all of this rhetoric about access and inclusion, and then at the same time, this thing that felt so simple of putting a bench in the gallery was just like not happening. Um, and yeah, and when I think about access, there's lots of things that are like really big long-term projects, but I was like, having a bench in a museum feels like really low-hanging fruit. Like I think or just like something that feels really doable. Um, and as I was researching why there aren't more places to sit, what I was learning is that oftentimes it has to do with curators and ways that they are imagining exhibitions that don't include places to sit. And I basically realized like if I made an artwork that was also functional as a place to sit, it was like a way of kind of working around that problem, and kind of like getting a bench into a space where there might otherwise not be a bench. And yeah, and I use my handwriting on them. So there's this like kind of handwritten element that I hope kind of also creates space for other people. Like maybe other people are like, oh, I don't need seating here, but I have other complaints about what's going on in this environment. But that it kind of like maybe opens up um, a space for complaint, or kind of an adversarial relationship with the existing infrastructure. Um, and yeah, and so in some ways like the way that I want people to experience the work is just to like be able to have a place to sit. I think also to be able to, for some people, I sometimes hear from people that it feels affirming to like have a need recognized. I think sometimes it's easy to forget that all of the spaces that we inhabit are not neutral or inherent, that they embody choices that have been made over and over. Um, and that those choices have an ideology and that we can say no, we don't want that, we want something different. But yeah, I think as time goes on, I mean that work I think is really the goal is sort of to make itself obsolete. Like my vision is not that like I have a bench in every museum. I don't even know how like, you know, my bench making skill, I can make a pretty simple bench, but yeah, just that um yeah, that there's more kind of options in those spaces that yeah, that we have like couches and day beds and all sorts of different options.
But I
And
think how that furniture is an explicit invitation to people. Whether it is a person with a disability, a chronic illness, somebody who is aging, it is an explicit invitation and a symbol that you are welcome, right? Because so often there is just baseline expectations that you should be able to exist in a space in a certain way. And I think so much of your work asks the question of who is this space for? Potentially also, who is it not for? And how can we make it be more for them? But what's been your most surprising or powerful kind of response or reaction to your practice that you've seen to date?
I mean, for me, I think it's always just like when, yeah, just when people reach out and say that the work like moved them in some way. I definitely don't have any, like for me, the model of change is not like, oh, I critique the institution and then suddenly they're like, things are going to be different. I'm much more interested in like the way that the work reaches other people
Mm.
and, um, both within the space of the institution or even the way that like um, images or descriptions of the work circulate outside of that. But then that, um, I mean, and I've definitely had this experience with other people's work where it's like there's something that I didn't know I needed or I didn't know I could ask for. And then I see it being offered and I'm like, oh, okay. That. Um, and so I think that's what I'm interested in is like, yeah, this kind of like way that we can reach each other in
Mm.
order to, um, yeah, organize together to hopefully make change.
I'm seeing in the chat comments from some people, even Suleiman, talking about, no longer accepting the notion that accessibility benefits everyone. And I think for many of us who are working in the space or require accessibility to be able to engage in spaces, there is a lot of assumptions or myths or maybe even mantras or statements. Is there any myth or assumption about accessibility that you'd love to see disappear or change?
Well, yeah, I mean, I love that rejection of accessibility benefits everyone. I think I haven't read that blog post, but I definitely feel like I always feel this like underlying eugenics logic to that of like, yeah, just that a person's needs aren't okay just because they need them. There has to be this like other benefit attached to them. And yes, exactly. Accessibility for disabled people is enough because disabled people are enough. So well said. And but yeah, in terms of other myths that I feel like, yeah, that I'd love to see go, I think definitely the idea that access is boring. I think yeah, it's like anything where it's like, yeah, sometimes it's boring, but also sometimes it can be weird or fun or pleasurable or and yeah, it's never just one thing.
For me, it's that accessibility is a distraction. I think uh, I often hear that a lot, particularly as we think about live spaces or events, even webinars of this nature, and that accessibility can only be invested in if disabled people are in the room. And to give some context to that, what I mean is how it often comes about is that a disabled person has to say and kind of emotionally invest and say, I want to go. Can you put access in place in order for me to be able to attend even this webinar? And I think one of the great challenges with that is it creates no readiness or no pipeline, and it places all of the responsibility and labor on disabled people in order to ask for their access. Whereas if we create access by design, access as a baseline, and continuously evolve and increase that baseline, it means that disabled people can thrive easier, or at least with less friction, and that we are just creating that readiness, whether it's in community, in the workplace. I think we all have a responsibility to continue to lift that baseline. I'm going to just mention to people who are in attendance at the webinar that there is still an opportunity for you to pose your question to Finn by using the Q&A box. We have some great ones that are coming in, and I'm going to go to the questions in just 5 minutes. So if you have a question, please do submit it there, and we will be able to ask and facilitate them. I don't want to leave this conversation without acknowledging what's happening in the world and being really mindful that the anti-DEI rhetoric, and it's so much more than rhetoric, it is a reduction and an erasure of policy and legislation, which in turn is an erasure of rights and dignity. How are you processing this pushback as someone who works at the intersection of art, activism, and access?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much bad news and there's so much yeah, I mean, I think about the way that, for example, like Medicare is being attacked in the United States and just like the tremendous yeah, I mean, it's like it's so violent. Um I think for me, yeah, the work feels the same. The goal is always liberation for all people everywhere. And, we keep moving towards that. And in ways that state structures are failing us, we need to build outside of that. I'm always inspired by mutual aid efforts and free clinics and things like that that are yeah, showing what's possible peer to peer. And um, yeah, so I think for me, I also um, yeah, I mean, I think it's so hard to process everything that's happening. Taking it bit by bit, and yeah, but I think for me, trying not to get distracted from, like how I ultimately want the world to be. Um,
And I think in spaces like this, which are often majority disabled, I think it's always really important that we iterate the necessity for our activism to be intersectional. As we look even to the US, for example, and the reduction of Section 504, which is linked to Medicaid, reasonable adjustments and accommodations, I think we need to be really clear that our activism is also for the trans community, that our activism is also for disabled people of color and by disabled people of color, because I think for too long, movements have continued to exclude those who are most marginalized. And to also be really mindful that while what is happening in the US absolutely has a global impact, but whether we look to Palestine, Ukraine, Sudan, that harm being caused to disabled people is global, and our activism must also be global. And I think despite all of that, there is positivity and being rooted in disability justice movements. And also, I think being focused on what can be done now, both in the short term, but also in the long term. And how do we look to systemic change rather than just individual actions, though those are valuable? How do we look to that system wide change to think about not just today, tomorrow, but forever? But I don't want to leave us on a note of that tone, but I also think it's really important that we name it because everybody is feeling it in chest, hairs at the back of their neck. This feels like a very, very vulnerable time to be disabled, to be different in any way. But we have some questions from our wonderful audience. So, my first question comes from Sam. How do you recommend inviting folks to participate in intersectional projects? How to create maybe a council to drive access projects in museums and campuses?
I feel like Sinead, maybe you have more experience with this than I do. I think, yeah, I mean, well, I mean, one thing I will say is I over and over I see the impact of disabled artists and ways that, yeah, things become possible within that structure, and um, yeah, I mean, obviously I'm a little bit biased, but I think I think museums working with disabled artists is yeah.
I can maybe give a couple of points on that. When we think about co-design as a methodology, which I think is far better than inclusive design and universal design, but co-design and community-centered practices, which is about sharing power, creating feedback loops, valuing insights, contributions, and lived experience. When we're creating councils, advisory councils, or committees, very specific consideration has to be given to the power structure. So I think so often we create councils to invite feedback, but is that feedback actually going to change things or systems, or is it a broadcast channel? And I think before inviting anybody to participate in a committee, acknowledgement around those power structures and what the capacity is for feedback and change, I think is really vital. Making sure that, there is either a chair or somebody who's leading that conversation who potentially isn't the museum or the gallerist or whatever the authority isn't the lead person on that. So somebody to be able to scaffold and echo those voices and insights. And the other thing I would say very briefly is making sure that you're economically valuing people, because I think so often we say to people, come, tell us what you need, tell us what you want, we will make systems better. One, that's not guaranteed, and two, lived experience as intellectual property. So making sure that you're valuing that and valuing that skill set and expertise. And also when you are economically valuing it, make sure you're doing that fairly and make sure that you're doing that flexibly. Being mindful of what people are participating right now. You may want to pay them in a voucher. You may want to pay them with different ways of getting that economic value, paying them by invoicing, etc., may not be the most accessible way for people. So making sure that you're having considerations for all of those aspects before entering into that kind of power dynamic with disabled people or any community, I think is key. We have a question from Emily around alt text. Are there any types of descriptions, phrases, or language you would recommend we avoid when treating alt text as poetry? For example, should we try not to use, in quotes, site-centric phrases like looks like, or in this photo you can see? For context, I'm an adaptive sports journalist and currently working on an oral history and photo archive of rock climbers with disabilities. Emily, put the link into the chat. We need to know more. But Finn, I'm going to pass to you.
I'm sure that there's lots of different opinions about this. I know that Bojana, my collaborator, definitely bristles when someone is doing a description and says, here you see, because you're identifying the audience as someone who has a certain type of like normative sight. So yeah, I mean, I think but yeah, I definitely will sometimes use things like looks like to me or things like that when I'm like trying to like yeah, report back from my own visual experience and what if there's uncertainty for me. I mean, I think that's often something that comes up is like there's actually a lot of ambiguity in what sighted people see and how we interpret it. And so trying to like, yeah, sometimes I want that to come through in the alt text that I'm making a guess or I'm not certain or so yeah, things like that. But I think that's definitely the first one is one that I definitely am conscious of is like not assuming that the reader has a certain experience or would experience the image in a certain way.
What I really want to do after this conversation is create a kind of open sourced Google Doc where we create synonyms for looks like, so that we have this kind of shared vocabulary if we need or want to be able to make that alt text more informed. I have a question from Mary who asks a couple of different questions, but do you have advice on creating thought-provoking, interactive installations that convey a message or theme? And then kind of a sub question on what tools, software, or technology do you recommend for creating inclusive multi-art form events, particularly in music and dance?
Let's see. Well, in terms of the second question, I think Zoom has a lot of limitations, but I also have been so excited by the way that disabled people have been using this platform to, yeah, host dance parties, to share performance, to have a lot of really rich layers of access, to offer remote participation during the ongoing pandemic, and also acknowledging the ways that, before COVID, there were also like lots of people who were at home or couldn't participate in public spaces. So yeah, I mean, I think like all of these technologies that come to us via giant corporations, there's lots to be critical of and lots that could improve. But I also think, yeah, disabled people are really good at using what we have and making it work. And so yeah, that's one that comes up for me around the second question. Can you actually repeat the first question for me?
What I might also do, Finn, to be mindful of time, is share these questions with you afterwards, and maybe we can get some answers back to people on email also.
Cool.
I was just going to recommend Inclusive Dance Cork to Mary, which is run by a disabled woman, Bojana Coklyat, which might be a useful resource for you in thinking about that piece around dance in particular. I want to end with a question from Claire. Claire says, "This was a gorgeous conversation, and thank you so much, Finn, for sharing your empathy and expertise. This is not intended to be reductionist, but I wonder if you could share something that gives you hope."
I have been feeling one of the things that I feel like um, has been giving me some hope or solace recently is looking to um, like historic movements and just like what people have done in other times of crisis or how I think like ACT UP is always something that I'm really interested in. Also like decolonial or anti-colonial movements in the 50s and 60s. And yeah, I mean there's obviously like so many things, but I think for me, um yeah, just looking at kind of like other moments when people have yeah, tried to support each other, tried to make change against big, powerful systems has been something that's been nourishing to me recently.
And that we're not alone, and that while this feels different and awful, it has felt different and awful before. So, what can we learn from those people in the past? I had the great privilege of seeing some of your knitting this week because Finn and I both knit. I've just completed a blanket, and Finn has knitted many a beanie. So I think knitting as a restorative practice gives me hope. But Finn, I want to thank you enormously for your time, for sharing your practice and your expertise with us. As a reminder to everybody, the recording will be shared with you of this session, along with the resources and the links and the transcripts. It will be available on tiltingthelens.com next week, but all of you will receive an email with those assets and details. If you have additional questions that you didn't get to ask, please do send us them, and we will do our best to try to answer them. At Tilting the Lens, we're always trying to create moments like this for community by community. So if you have an idea of a webinar, if you'd love to participate in a webinar like this, please do email us, team@accessibility. No, that's the wrong email address. I'm going to try that again. We'll do that for the edit. If you'd like to do a webinar with us, please do let us know. It's team@tiltingthelens.com. I want to thank our interpreters, Alton and James. I want to thank our captioner, Kim. I want to thank the incredible Tilting the Lens team, Emma, who's been leading on this, Connie and Laya in the back end, and Finn, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to everybody who joined us. And yeah, I loved what Patricia said earlier in the chat, which was that disabled people get to receive access without feeling like a burden, without feeling like compromise. Access is beautiful. Thank you all. We will see you again soon.